Hi. Have you ever wondered why yield management in digital media is so much harder than it is in the airline industry or the hotel industry? If you have, then this is the video for you. I first shared these concepts at Pricing Week, which is a conference generally for pricing professionals, but I wanted to share them here in this forum for people in digital advertising because they're just as critical, if not more so, for people who are at publishers and ad tech companies. So, even if you are an expert in digital advertising, you'll want to stick around to the end because that's where I show what we can learn if you are in digital advertising from the rest of the pricing industry. So, firstly, let's have a look at a web page that I know all too well, the Yahoo homepage. And while I'm giving a web page as an example, this could just as easily be an app. The thing that a lot of people don't think about is that every pixel on this page is optimized for both the consumer experience, in other words, trying to get them to stay on the page, and also for the monetization experience, which is another way of saying try to make as much money as possible for every page that loads. And so let's dig into the different ways that Yahoo's making money off this page. I've circled in different colors the different types of monetization experiences. And what we see at the very top of the page is the search box. And the way in which that's going to work is that the user is going to type something into that. It's going to get redirected to one of the major search engines, either Google or Bing. And in the case of Yahoo, it would be redirected towards Bing, and ads would get served against that. And in those ad experiences, it's going to be run on the back end in an auction-based experience. So generally, search runs as an auction. If we look at some of the things that I've circled in orange here, clearly they're Amazon type deals or affiliate deals. They're going to be some kind of rev share with the providing entity. In this case, it looks like it's Amazon in the bottom left and probably Amazon in the middle as well. So now let's look at the boxes that I have circled in red. Those would be what we'd call traditional display banners. And so you see an ad for E-Trade at the top of the page. You see an E-Trade ad that actually hasn't fully rendered on the right hand side halfway down, and you see another ad in the very bottom right. And I considered actually trying to do something to make that show correctly, but actually makes a really good point. This would be an ad that for some users would not appear when their web page loads if they're on a different resolution monitor than me. In my experience is that less than half the ad loaded, so it wouldn't actually usually be considered a viewable ad. The other things that aren't shown on the page are different types of ad experiences, including social, where you've got someone like Meta or the Facebook type experience. And then the other thing that's not shown because it's really hard to show is ad tech, and that's the sale of advertising technology from one provider to another, and we may get into some of that. So if you look at this web page, there is a lot crammed on there, and to some extent you can think about this being like an airplane that's about to take off. When the web page loads, a lot of different things all happen at the same time. A call goes out saying who wants that ad slot, and you can think of that as being analogous to passengers buying the tickets and walking onto the plane. As soon as the plane takes off, the opportunity to sell that seat is gone. As soon as the web page is finished loading, the opportunity for an ad experience is gone. And that's why this idea of sort of cramming things into the page is very similar to cramming, frankly, passengers onto an airplane that's about to take off. So let's think about why this is a difficult thing. One of the reasons, and hopefully you're seeing a table now, is that within digital advertising, there are just so many different formats of products. I've shown you a lot of banner advertising. I haven't shown examples of video, but video in itself can be large form videos, small player. It could run for a few seconds or it could run for minutes. So you've got video ads, you've got native ads, you've got DO, which is digital out of home. Think billboards on the side of the road, or maybe it's advertisements that you're getting shown when you walk onto a plane like United, and the seat back in front of you might be showing you ads. And then you've got audio, which are ads like that would normally occur on like a podcast. So you've got tons of different formats, and within each one of those formats, you have sub-formats. And so here I've shown some examples of what would be considered banner sub-formats, and they're really just the pixel sizes: 300 by 250, 728 by 90, 600 by 160. These refer to the pixel sizes on the page. For video, you're going to have different subcategories. It might be the size of the player, it might be how long they run. They all have, dozens, or in some cases hundreds of different formats that could potentially run. Then within each one of these, there are different currencies, and this is where we start to get into a real explosion of different things. Many of you in digital advertising, of course, are familiar with the CPM, which is the cost per mil. In other words, what is the cost for 1,000 impressions to run? There is CPC, the cost per click, which is what it costs to literally get a consumer to click on an ad. CPA, the cost per action. CPR, which feels like it could be made up, but this is a cost per ride. That is a model that is used by someone like an Uber or a Lyft. And I could keep doing all sorts of different three-letter acronyms here for the different forms of currency. In some cases, they may get translated into a cost per mil if you're looking at how auctions run, etc. But in some cases not, and that absolutely leads a dimension of complexity. Then we have all the different types of data and targeting that are used by different advertisers and publishers. So you have things like demographic targeting. You could have audience targeting, meaning is someone a sports enthusiast or not. You have things like purchase intent. And every one of these is a different dimension. And when put together with the different types of product format, you get a multiplicative effect. So it's the cross combination explodes in terms of how many potential combinations you have that the buyer could be buying and the seller could be selling. One of the other reasons that this is a particularly difficult product compared to other pricing products is essentially no market data exists. There are some companies out there who sort of try to back into what they think is happening in the market. Some of them might be very specific and they'll track individual companies and they'll say, we think that Facebook or Google's pricing is up or down when they look at individual companies. But it's really, really hard to get a sense for what the pricing is. If you think about the airlines, for example, they can go onto each other's websites, pretend to be custom buyers and look at what is the price for a ticket from San Francisco to New York, for example. It's much harder or much less common to actually be able to go and look at what the price is to really transact within the digital media or digital advertising ecosystem. And then another thing that is well documented is that in our industry, in digital advertising, it is a very fragmented supply chain. There are a lot of hidden fees. And so when you think about all the different components, the DSPs, the SSPs, the verification vendors, the measurement vendors, the exchanges, they all have different models and they all have different ways in which they price. In some cases, this is visible to both the buyer and seller, but I think that's really the exception to the rule. For the most part, there are a lot of hidden fees, and that makes it even more difficult to think about how you're going to go through a pricing endeavor. All right, so that's why it's difficult. Let's think about why, again, the model is very different from the airline and to some extent the hotels, but I'm going to stay on the airlines here. If we think about the products, there are certainly tons of different products that are available in airline. I just booked a flight to New Zealand and it was very specific, out of SFO down to Auckland, New Zealand. I'm looking for a very specific leg, and my options are relatively limited. I've got a couple of different airlines that I can fly with. I've got a couple of different times of day, but for the most part, we're talking about products in the hundreds or potentially thousands that can be bought by an individual consumer at any given time. Maybe there's some differences whether you want economy class or business class, etc. But the options are very limited. For all the reasons that I just ran through on the previous slide, digital media has millions or billions or trillions of cross combinations, which is why so much of the industry has moved to auction, because it's almost impossible to price all of those different cross combinations using anything like a manual type mechanism. Another thing to think about is the impact of price. In the airline industry, if the airline raises its price, the ticket price by a few dollars, either the consumer will buy it and they'll make more money for that unit price, or they won't and the consumer will go away to another airline or won't buy the ticket. Digital media is very different because of the way in which the advertisers show up. They show up and they might have a budget for $1 million of media that they want to buy. When the price is raised, what that means is the price per impression might go up. But if they were buying a fixed amount of media, again $1 million, it just means they're getting less impressions. So if the advertiser is giving you as a publisher the $1 million, raising the price doesn't actually mean that you're going to get any more from that advertiser. Now, some people will quibble and say, but okay, you're freeing up some impressions that could be sold to somebody else. True, but in many situations, particularly if it's hand sold, that doesn't really matter. In other words, it's not clear that a price raise translates into additional revenue. Now think about the price response. In an airline, some of the least price sensitive customers, the business traveler, is the one who shows up at the last minute. They don't know what their plans are. They know they've got a new client. They need to change cities and they'll book a week in advance. Whereas the person going on their vacation, like the trip I just booked to New Zealand, they're potentially booking that months in advance. And so the most price sensitive customers are the ones that show up first in the airlines, whereas in digital media it's the reverse. The ones that are the least price sensitive tend to be the brands. They'll book in advance, whereas the ones who are the most price sensitive tend to be remnant buyers or performance advertisers, and they'll book at the last minute or book through a programmatic channel to ensure that they're getting the best pricing possible. Then think about the sales channels. Sales of airline tickets has now gone almost exclusively towards programmatic channels. I can go onto a website and book the ticket myself. Whereas, although a lot of buying has gone programmatic, particularly for traditional banners and display, you still see for innovation products, digital out of home, for podcasts, for other products, managed sales teams getting involved. And for that reason, you see a mix or hybrid of sales channels much more. So that's why, in many respects, even though we talk about digital ads and airlines both being yield management problems, they're in many cases very different problems. So one of the things that we should think about then is if you've got a yield management team within digital advertising, what are the things that they are doing? And some of these things are very similar to what a pricing team would do in other industries. And on this chart, probably the first green box and the last green box would be familiar to any pricing team in almost any industry, which is setting a managed rate card, potentially managing some kind of programmatic channel, although again that's almost unique to the digital advertising industry. But then they would also, if you're a pricing team in any industry, you'd be setting up some kind of deal desk to deal with your biggest buyers. You might be setting rules for your buyer preferences. The boxes in the middle tend to be, in some cases, unique to digital advertising. If you've got a pricing and yield team in digital advertising, they're probably thinking about auction rules. Maybe they control the auction themselves, or at the least they're thinking about how to deal with their programmatic partner, thinking about the type of auction that's run. Is it first price or second price? How would I set up private marketplaces? How do I set up private deals? Those are the kinds of things that a pricing and yield management team is going to need to think about. Inventory management is also particularly difficult in our industry because of the variance in the way that inventory is created. If you've got a huge news story, an earthquake, a war, Taylor Swift's marriage, wedding, those are all events that create spikes which can't be predicted very well in advance. Yes, you can have seasonality. Yes, you might have time of day and time of week effects that can be modeled out. But we have in our industry a lot of variability that creates some unique challenges around how you manage inventory. The other thing that's unique about our industry is you can't, not just forecasting of the inventory, but you can create your own inventory by putting new ads on the page, changing the rotation times in terms of how often they're viewed. And so we see that a lot more in our industry, in digital advertising, the pricing and yield management team can take an active role in the creation of the inventory, whereas in others, it's more of a forecasting role. And then the last box here, incentives. Sales and advertiser incentives are clearly a large part of how, particularly if you're managing a direct sales team, you need to be on top of that if you are in pricing and yield management. Just a couple more slides here. One of the things I talked about when I was talking to the general pricing audience, and I think it was useful to them, but actually I think some people in our industry don't think about it enough. What are some of the things that work well within other industries, or what would a pricing team be expected to do that doesn't work well in digital advertising? I just spent some time talking about the inventory forecasting models, why it's much more difficult to forecast inventory in digital advertising. The second piece is price and elasticity analysis. Sometimes I work with people who are relatively new to the industry, and the first thing they want to do is jump in and do some kind of price elasticity analysis. I've spent a lot of time trying to do this. Back, those who know my history, I was at a company called Wrapped. We sold pricing software, and we tried to do it in this industry. It's very, very difficult for reasons that I won't get into here, but part of which are covered in Ari Paparo's new book, Yield, which is talking about Google and some of the manipulation of different exchanges. You have challenges with price elasticity. One, because of the variance of how your sales team sells. Two, because of the fact that within the ecosystem, many of the different components aren't well understood or can be manipulated in a way that would make a traditional price elasticity analysis not work. And so the bottom bullet here is actually a function of the first two. Because you can't really do inventory forecasting very well, and it's really tough to do price elasticity, that's why we don't see more of the traditional pricing and yield management software within the digital advertising industry. Okay, so that's why it's a tough problem. We've spent a number of minutes here talking about the challenges. What is it that the digital advertising industry can learn from the pricing industry and vice versa? Because one of the observations when I attended the pricing conference is that there's not a lot of overlap. Digital advertising tends to be a world unto itself. Pricing hasn't really spent a lot of time within the digital advertising industry. And one of the ironies was when I was presenting, both Pricing Week and Advertising Week were on at exactly the same time. And I was probably one of the only people on the planet who actually cared about that fact. Okay, so what digital advertising needs? I assert that we need more talent in pricing and yield management in our industry. It's very understaffed, particularly on the publisher side. And I could just have put as easily here within retail and the media networks, where I think there is a significant need for more talent within a lot of the retail media networks to manage the margin and manage the effectiveness of their overall network. So the point I make here is everybody knows that they have a pricing and yield problem, but very few people know how to solve it. The second point is that I think digital advertising, pricing, yield management can learn a lot about the discipline and rigor that other industries have implemented. The point here I make is that digital media is still very seat of the pants. A lot of stuff gets made up on the fly, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it always feels like things are being reinvented from scratch each time, without a lot of the process and discipline that you would expect. One of the things I talked about on the other side of this graphic is that I think there's a lot of things that are done well within digital advertising that could be used to help the pricing community learn about where they could weigh in more. And one of those is that digital evolves fast. Publishers are always trying out different models. They're always looking at different pricing techniques. They're always doing experiments. And one of the questions I got asked at the end of this presentation was, what advantages does digital advertising have compared to other industries? And one of the things I talked about is that usually in a lot of these companies, they tend to be pretty technical. You tend to have good product and engineering people. And so if there's a problem that needs to be solved through good experimentation or automation, you have engineers that you can call on to do that. And so I've seen some really interesting experimentations done over the last few years. And the other piece I talked about was that because of this experimentation, because the fact that things are moving so quickly, there are often new paradigms in terms of how pricing is done or how we think about market dynamics. And if they can ever get their hands on the data, I think this is going to be fertile ground for a lot of researchers in future years in terms of all of the different things that have been created. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I'm James Deaker. I'm the Yield Doctor. I hope you enjoyed this content.